there's a big difference between our space and pharma. So you talk about the traditional model and how you can bridge things differently to get therapies out there. There's a big difference in terms of perception, in terms of the opportunities of regenerative medicine therapies versus drugs. There's nobody out there praising drug companies for their innovative science, right? I'm sorry to the folks in the room, from the big pharma folks, but in reality, everyone's out there looking for exciting science to come from this space, and that's why CIRM got funded in the first place. You know, we raised our initial angel capital in the end of 2008, in October 2008 to May 2009. So, you know, I don't play the violin for folks who are worried about the troubles in getting capital these days. That was about the toughest time I've ever seen. But it was the power of the story, it was the power of regenerative medicine, cell science, and cell therapy that really appeals to people out there. And that's why we have the opportunities to get additional federal funding. I think if we work together, groups like ARM, I know Morey is one of the co-founders of ARM, the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, can move the needle. The Defense Department is already out there funding clinical trials to move the needle forward. So Stratogen in Wisconsin got, I think, $20 million or $10 million in funding for a trial to actually prove their therapy out. That's the kind of thing that can move someone to the point where you can attract private investment. And I think we can encourage a lot more of that. It's in everybody's best interest to continue to do that, and I think we can.
Any other thoughts on? So, so let's move off of. I mean, we talked about sources of capital, and certainly the session before this was also talking about that. But for the model itself, and we're going to get into this in the next panel. We're going to be talking about reimbursement. I mean, ultimately, it's about developing products. And Bob, you know, I think in your introduction, I mean, this is clearly something you all are thinking about all the time. And, you know, I think one of the things that everyone struggles with in this space is, as we progress through the clinic, you know, are we going to be at a point at the end of this where we have commercial scale, where we have a reimbursement model, where we really understand what it is to create product in this space, and is this something most of the companies in this space understand?
I think it's something that the companies in this space certainly struggle with every day and talk about and work through. I don't know that everybody fully understands what these products will look like, but there is no, and we sort of were just generally optimists, right? There's no doubt in my mind that that there are unique challenges that are presented to this industry, but that's no different than any other developing industry, and solutions form around the challenges that are presented to the industry. So what has to form here? We've got to think about building into products the sort of stability that allows them to be distributed. Those are some mistakes that were made early on that people didn't think of. And they're relatively simple now, and everybody understands that. All the way right through from the FDA. I mean, the first thing that most of our client base gets from the FDA now is, have you done shipping validations, right? They're not really thinking through the fact that you might have to extend those and make sure you've got 2 days on either side so that you don't have to build, 3 facilities, you can build 1. Those kind of economic things. But those are small changes that could be made. We're seeing those now. Those are much more clear now because of people plowing the course before, and we're learning those lessons. So I'm very optimistic that that there will be solutions around these, and I think the reimbursement mechanisms will form around that. These are some of yesterday's discussions talked about the cost savings of these therapies. We kind of talking out of both sides of our mouth on that one, because if we want to be extending people's lives a long time, then I don't know if we're going to be making the healthcare system less burdened or more burdened. But certainly I think it's going to be very difficult for a healthcare system to avoid real therapies that provide for cures of what today are debilitating and fatal diseases.
So I'll add on to that a little bit. I mean, I agree, but I think that in the world there's things that change and things that don't. And one of the immutable laws these days is really that the cost containment in healthcare has to happen, and that's something that's not going to change. So in thinking of a business model and how we put this together, we also have to be thinking of that cost on that end product. And Dendreon is probably a good example. I mean, with the $100,000 cell therapy, it was in a lot of business plans 10 years ago, and with the idea that over volume that would come down somewhat, but it's in this environment, in this world, it's probably a non-starter really, at least for the major indications. So I mean, as we think business model, we also have to think, what does that ultimately mean in terms of cost of goods on your therapy? And so that, to me, that's really kind of the heart of what we have to get at, and making not only the benefit, which is critical, but also that it's affordable and can be justified and reimbursed in the healthcare economics.
I was going to say exactly the same thing, is that if you take out allogeneic and direct gene transfer and so on, to the extent you're talking about autologous cell therapies and then autologous modified cell products, you're not going to get away from it. It's an order of magnitude more expensive to do than traditional pharmaceuticals, and therefore the kinds of value that has to deliver from an outcomes perspective in terms of unmet medical needs, that has to justify that delta. So from a business plan perspective, from targeting disease indications, from looking at outcomes, to looking at reimbursement, you have to factor in a cost of goods that is going to be significantly higher than conventional approaches.
And I think if there's been one big, huge difference in the way we approach development of cell therapies today than we did before, is that we look very much at the outcome before, but now people are thinking about how to build in early into the development processes to build in these changes so that we can, at the end of the day, make them more deliverable, which also includes the cost of goods assessment. There's a lot of automation plays out there and the like that try to get around this issue. It might be too early to automate something on day one, but we start to build in the right sort of development metrics so that later on these things can be more easily or more readily automated. And I think that makes a big difference in these autologous cell therapies, because you're right that it may be that a lot of volume going through a Dendreon facility will make it less costly. That's absolutely true, but will it ever make it cheap? No. I mean, it's a people model, it's a labor model, and that model just has limitations.
And I think that's right, and I think that the therapies that we're going to be able to do are the ones that are more transformative. So if you look at biotech and why the early biotech drugs were so successful, I mean, they were inherently cytokines that completely changed the game in what we could treat. They weren't small molecule drugs. And I think when you're talking about something like Prevenge, the challenge there is that people have wised up. Oncology is a great hot market because you can do things faster through regulatory, and it cures cancer. Well, from a reimbursement model, curing cancer for 4 extra months doesn't exactly equate to it being a good investment to spend $100,000 to do so. And so I think as we focus as a field, the opportunities are going to be, there's always going to be it's a two-axis graph, where you can actually do things. You have to add enough value to justify your cost of goods. You have to be able to work on your cost of goods and lower that to achieve that value. Mahendra Rao in the opening comments said that critical ischemia is going to be an area that's going to be one of the earliest wins because the science is there to help justify that, but that's an area where your margins are going to be a lot narrower. People simply aren't going to pay really a 5-figure number to help out in there. So really when you get to what we're going to be able to use, what the options are, autologous is harder to do in that space.
Yeah. Well, I think this is certainly, again, something that we're discussing all the time within the Alliance. I mean, this is something that's very important for everyone to understand. I think, though, it's a challenge, though, when we're dealing with some of the publics that we have to spend a lot of time talking to and explaining this field to. But again, one of the things that's unique about this sector is also the strong relationships we have with a number of the larger companies that, not the large pharmas of the world, but the Lonzas, the GE Healthcares, some Progenitor to a certain extent, but a lot of the companies that are going to be our commercial partners in this space. And it's so it's a collaborative enterprise. That's a term that we've heard throughout the discussion of the last couple of days. And so these are companies that need each other. We certainly need to understand everything. It's cost of goods, but it's we heard from Alona's session today about some of the challenges to potency